Hello everyone, and welcome to Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and today we're going to be discussing Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49. Now, Pynchon is one of my favorite authors, and we're going to be talking about a lot of his books on this podcast, including Inherent Vice, V, and probably, eventually, hopefully, Gravity's Rainbow, his magnum opus. Though that podcast might take me a little bit longer to prepare. But I wanted to start with The Crying of Lot 49 because I think it's one of his most accessible books. Maybe you could argue Inherent Vice is more accessible, written in a slightly more conventional form. But for those of you just starting out with Pynchon, or if you've never read anything by him before, I actually really recommend The Crying of Lot 49. I think it's a great entry into the Pynchonian style, the paranoia, the postmodernism. It's written in the 60s, it's set in the 60s, and I think it captures the flavor of Pynchon's writing, maybe the best of all of his novels, because it's so concise and self-contained. It's essentially a novella, or it feels like a novella, or at least a very short novel. The basic storyline of The Crying of Lot 49, as many of you are probably aware, is pretty straightforward as well. It's essentially a mystery, so it's pretty easy to follow, despite the very confusing elements that appear in the book. Basically, our heroine, Oedipa Maas, is a housewife, and she starts investigating a conspiracy that she discovers after she's been assigned as the executor of her ex-lover's will. And that essentially kicks off the novel. And the rest of it basically follows Oedipa as she goes from place to place, trying to discover the origins of various things in her ex-lover's will, and the resulting conspiracy that she discovers about two rival mail carriers, two rival mail companies that have been engaging in a secret war, right, for the last several centuries. When you say the plot out loud like that, it sounds pretty ludicrous, and in some ways it is. It's meant to be comedic. It's meant to be absurd in that very postmodern way. But I think underlying it, Pynchon is saying something really interesting and really intelligent about the idea of conspiracy theories, the idea of postmodernism more generally as a literary movement, and kind of the way in which people started to perceive the world in the 1960s. Now, in my creative writing classes, I always say, when we're trying to determine what makes a novel great, how do we determine if something is a masterpiece, one of the criteria that I think we should always think about is, what is the novel saying about its own era? What is the novel saying about the time period in which it was written? Because I think that's how you judge the success of an author, but that's also, if you are an author, how you can judge your own success, how you can judge the worthiness of something you create. Is it simply a bit of fluff that doesn't really say anything, that's fun and exciting, but not really that insightful? Or are you trying to say something about the period in which you live? That, I think, is what separates what these days we call literary fiction or literature from other kinds of books. And that's not to denigrate other kinds of books, but on this podcast, I'm interested in literature, right? I'm interested in great books because I think those are the books that are worth preserving. Those are the books that our culture should be holding on to. And as I discussed last week, we're in an era in which our culture is really losing reading and literature. Just today, in fact, the Washington Post announced that they were shutting down the books section of their newspaper. And, when I read that, I thought, I'm very glad that I have decided to do this podcast, because if the big institutions in our world have decided to abandon literature and culture, it falls on the rest of us to try and save it, to try and preserve it. So I think The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon is one of those books that says something very profound about the 1960s, and that's why I want to talk about it today. So I think it's best with Crying of Lot 49 to dive right in, to not talk too much about the context. The novel was published in 1966. Okay, a few years after John F. Kennedy's assassination, before the assassinations of RFK and Martin Luther King, but right at the heart of the 60s, right at the heart of all of that energy, the protest movement, etc. So all of that is kind of happening in the background, right? Something to keep in mind. But with a book like this, I think it's best to just let the language flow over you. That is something I'm going to talk about a lot. Pynchon is a master of sentences, a master of language. And we're going to see that in this book with a lot of the sentences that I've picked out for us to read. The best place to start, I think, is just at the beginning. So, as I think this first sentence really introduces us to what the novel is going to be about. One summer afternoon, Miss Oedipa Maas came home from a Tupperware party whose hostess had put perhaps too much kirsch in the fondue to find that she, Oedipa, had been named executor, or, she supposed, executrix, of the estate of one Pierce Inverarity, a California real estate mogul who had once lost $2 million in his spare time, but still had assets numerous and tangled enough to make the job of sorting it all out more than honorary. Now, I think it's kind of an intentionally complicated sentence. On the one hand, it does all the things that an opening sentence should do. It introduces our main character, Oedipa Maas. It introduces the primary conflict of the novel. She has been named the executor of the will of Pierce Inverarity. And we're going to learn later who he is and who he is to her specifically. But notice the complicated syntax of this opening sentence. We have a pretty straightforward beginning. One summer afternoon, Miss Oedipa Maas came home from a Tupperware party. But then we start to get our subordinate clauses, whose hostess had put perhaps too much kirsch in the fondue. Okay, so we're kind of setting up a possibility of almost like intoxication, right? Drunkenness. A feeling that Oedipa is a little hazy. She's a little drunk from the fondue. She's not fully there. She's not fully kind of rational, you could say. To find out that she had been named executor of the estate of one Pierce Inverarity. Now again, the sentence could end there. Pretty complicated, but it could end there. But it doesn't end there. It continues with a series of additional clauses. And those last few words, right, whose assets were numerous and tangled enough to make the job of sorting through it pretty difficult, just like the sentence we're just reading, right? It's also kind of tangled. And it's a little difficult to kind of untangle it when you're first hearing it. And I think that's kind of Pynchon's way of signaling to us that the experience of reading this novel is going to mirror Oedipa's experience of untangling the estate of her ex-lover, Pierce. And I think that's just a great way to open a novel, a great way to open it with a sentence that, through its syntax, demonstrates for your readers exactly what you're in for, exactly the type of sentences that you're going to see. Okay, so the other, I think, passage that tells us a lot about what this novel is going to be about from the opening is towards the end of the opening chapter. So most of the opening chapter is kind of set up. We're introduced to Oedipa, we're introduced to her life. But I want to pick up on a particular image that Pynchon uses at the very end of the chapter. Oedipa is thinking about Pierce. She's thinking about her old relationship with Pierce, and she's thinking about how one time they had been in Mexico City, and they had seen these paintings by a surrealist painter named Remedios Varo. So Remedios Varo, she was an actual surrealist painter, and so what Pynchon is describing here, I think, is an actual painting that she did. But I just want to read the description here because, and as I read this description, think about how this connects to Oedipa as the protagonist of this novel. In Mexico City, they somehow wandered into an exhibition of paintings by the beautiful Spanish exile Remedios Varo. In the central painting of a triptych titled Bordando el Manto Terrestre were a number of frail girls with heart-shaped faces, huge eyes, spun gold hair, prisoners in the top room of a circular tower, embroidering a kind of tapestry which spilled out the slit windows and into a void, seeking hopelessly to fill the void. For all the other buildings and creatures, all the waves, ships, and forests of the earth were contained in this tapestry, and the tapestry was the world. So this is an image of basically a series of girls in this tower They are embroidering a tapestry, but the tapestry is the world itself. And I think that is a symbol of what we're about to read. Where Oedipa is going to be discovering, right, the sort of secret conspiracy behind Pierce's will. And as she does, as she's uncovering this conspiracy, she's constantly going to be questioning herself. Is this real? Or is this simply something in my own head? And that's not a question that Pynchon answers in this book. The ambiguity is part of the point. And so I think this image of a person creating the very world that is around her, that is an excellent description of conspiracy. Again, I think that's what Pynchon is trying to say, that conspiracy, as this image demonstrates, conspiracy, when you start to become paranoid, when you start to believe in a conspiracy theory, you start to create the very world that you are imagining. And I think that's Pynchon's, essential symbol for what it feels like to be alive in the 1960s, to be constantly inventing and creating these conspiracies. And I think for us today, that continues to be true in a way Pynchon could not have imagined when he wrote this book. The existence of the internet, right, makes this image so almost like obvious to us, right? The idea that we are creating the world around us. All right, so there's lots of things we could discuss about Crying of Lot 49, lots of passages we could pick out, but the center of the book is obviously a play that was put on, a Jacobean revenge drama called The Courier's Tragedy. And this play, which basically features in chapter 3 of the book, this play basically becomes the significant event of the first part of the novel, because it's this play, right, that introduces Oedipa to the possibility of the conspiracy of the two different mail carriers. And Pynchon has great fun satirizing these type of Jacobean revenge plays, right? He kind of, creates this kind of elaborate story about these feuding Italian sort of families and backstabbings and betrayals and excessive violence, which of course is kind of a satire of this particular type of drama, right? This particular type of play from the 1600s. But let's take a look at one particular moment in the play. There is a reference, and this is the first reference in the novel, to Tristero, right? The name that is going to become very significant. He that was last as Thurn and Taxis knew, now recks no lord but the stiletto's thorn. And tacit lies the gold once knotted horn. No hallowed skein of stars can ward, I trow, who's once been set his tryst with Tristero. Tristero. The word hung in the air as the act ended, and all lights were for a moment cut. Hung in the dark to puzzle Oedipa Mass, but not yet to exert the power over her it was to. So notice the way Pynchon writes that scene, because Oedipa at this point does not know the meaning of the word Tristero. It doesn't mean anything to her yet, but Pynchon is telling us through his narrator that it will come to mean something for her. And so he's almost signaling to us, like, pay attention to this moment, to the word Tristero. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Tristero and what it symbolizes in the book. So to give a very brief summary, right? In the book, there are these two postal companies, right, that are essentially in this centuries-long feud. One of the companies was actually a real postal company, Thurn and Taxis, a noble house that was given sort of a monopoly over the postal system during the Holy Roman Empire. So that's a real historical reference that Pynchon was aware of, Pynchon knew about. The other, Tristero, is Pynchon's invention. And over the course of the novel, Oedipa essentially discovers more and more about this secret postal company, Tristero, and what they come to represent. And the trick that Pynchon delivers, right, through this novel is he doesn't really provide a clear answer of who or what Tristero is. In the play, in The Courier's Tragedy, Tristero come across as kind of villainous figures, right? These men in black who essentially assassinate, right, the protagonist of the play. There's also some associations that seem to connect Trastero with the right-wing conspiracy theories. There's a character in the novel called Mike Fallopian, very entertaining name. He's kind of a right-wing guy who sees Trastero as this kind of underground, secret, dark, right-wing conspiracy. At the same time, later in the novel, we also discover that some people see Trastero as almost the opposite, as this sort of counterculture buried in secret, the sort of left behind of America, the waste of America. Because the acronym WASTE is something Oedipa is going to discover throughout the novel as an acronym that the people who know about Trastero use to signal to each other, "We await silent Trastero's empire." And Pynchon wisely leaves the nature of this empire vague. He does not tell us whether Trastero is good or bad. Instead, he presents this ambiguity, this idea that the possibility of this like dark underground secret society, is it good? Is it bad? Who can say? And Oedipa does not even really seem to come to any conclusions. We're going to look at the passage where Oedipa reflects on everything that she experiences in the novel towards the end, and we'll see what conclusions she comes to. But I think that's very insightful of Pynchon, because especially these days when we think about the nebulous and fluid nature of conspiracy. On the one hand, conspiracy theories were sometimes associated with the left wing, right? With people who believed that the CIA killed JFK, right? People who believed that the CIA killed RFK, right? All kinds of conspiracy theories abound involving the CIA, right? Figures like James Jesus Angleton, the great poet spy master of the mid-century. These days, conspiracy theories seem to be more associated with the right wing. People believing that the 2020 election was stolen, for example. People believing that global warming was a hoax. And I think Pynchon wisely recognized that even in the 1960s. He did not define Trastero as left-wing or right-wing. Instead, he presents Trastero as purposefully ambiguous. I think what The Crying of Lot 49 is really about is the experience of trying to wrestle with clues regarding conspiracy. That, I think, is what the novel is really touching on, is we are like Oedipa. We are just lost little housewives wandering this vast, dark, crazy world, trying to piece together and make meaning from the little signs that we see. And this is, of course, postmodernism, right? Postmodernism is basically a movement that says there is no center. There is no truth. There is no order. The only thing you can do is take the fragments that you have and try and cobble together some imperfect meaning from them. But even this imperfect meaning that you create will be imperfect. It cannot capture the whole thing. The whole thing is beyond human perceptibility. Sometimes postmodern novels are described as systems novels. I think in this case, it's sort of a novel about a woman, a character, a protagonist like us, the readers, trying to understand the system, kind of comprehending, at the very least, that there is a system, but not much more about it. I think that's kind of the journey that Oedipa takes across this novel, is that by the end she realizes that there is something much bigger and vaster than she understood, but she doesn't actually understand it, and still doesn't understand it. It is still beyond her comprehension. And I think wisely Pynchon creates a novel that mimics that effect, because like Oedipa, we can try to extract some grand theory about what every symbol and every reference in The Crying of Lot 49 means. But that's not really the point. The point is simply to say our attempt to do that is what life is like for people in the second half of the 20th century, and I would argue the 21st century as well, because I think this book is one of those books that speaks to the present just as much as it does to Pynchon's time. All right, so I want to jump ahead now and look at one of my favorite passages. So, as Oedipa is wandering this maze of references and trying to find sort of the origin of all these things, she eventually comes to UC Berkeley. And UC Berkeley is an important symbol, of course, in the 1960s, associated with the free speech movement, with youth protesters. I went to Berkeley, and so maybe because of that, I have a particular fondness for this passage because, right, I know the place. But I think even aside from that, I think Pynchon is speaking, in this passage, Pynchon is writing about Berkeley in a particular way that I find very interesting, and I think speaks to, again, what he's trying to say and what he's trying to do in this novel. So let's just read this passage. This is in chapter 5, a few pages into chapter 5. And so she's essentially just describing the Berkeley campus. She's here to find a professor to talk to about some reference that she discovered, right? That might lead her somewhere. But pay attention to how Pynchon describes the campus. It was summer, a weekday, and mid-afternoon. No time for any campus Oedipa knew of to be jumping. Yet this one was. She came down slope from Wheeler Hall, through Sather Gate, into a plaza teeming with corduroy, denim, bare legs, blonde hair, horn rims, bicycle spokes in the sun, book bags, swaying card tables, long paper petitions dangling to earth, posters for undecipherable FSMs, YAFs, VDCs, suds in the fountain, students in nose-to-nose dialogue. So again, just notice the long sentence. This is a classic Pynchonian sentence, extremely long, full of details kind of piled on top of each other, but which give us a very great visual kind of image. So last week when we talked about Evelyn Waugh, I also praised his descriptive power, his sentences, but just think about the difference, right, in the style of the sentences. We don't necessarily have the same kind of measured, controlled style of Evelyn Waugh or some of those mid-century British writers. Here we have something a lot crazier, a lot wilder, a lot more off-kilter, right? In an essay I once wrote, I described it as it's like someone stacking a series of objects on top of each other in this very precarious tower. That's how a lot of Pynchon's sentences feel to me. Continuing on, she moved through it, carrying her fat book, attracted, unsure, a stranger, wanting to feel relevant, but knowing how much of a search among alternate universes it would take. For she had undergone her own educating at a time of nerves, blandness, and retreat among not only her fellow students, but also most of the visible structure around and ahead of them. This having been a national reflex to certain pathologies in high places only death had had the power to cure. And this Berkeley was like no somnolent sea-wash out of her own past at all, but more akin to those Far Eastern or Latin American universities you read about, those autonomous culture media where the most beloved of folklores may be brought into doubt, cataclysmic of dissents voiced, suicidal of commitments chosen, the sort that bring governments down. But it was English she was hearing as she crossed Bancroft Way, among the blonde children and the muttering Hondas and Suzukis. American English. What she's saying here is really interesting, right? So she's in Berkeley. She's in this kind of vibrant campus full of young people engaged in political activity, right? A classic image of a 1960s university, a 1960s American university. And she compares it to her own upbringing, her own college experience. And I think this is important to remember, right? She is not of the 60s hippie generation. She is slightly older. And I think that is also maybe kind of what Pynchon is feeling himself, right? Pynchon was born in 1937. So in the 1960s, he would have been in his 30s, right? In his 20s and his 30s. He would have been older than a college student. So I think Pynchon feels what Oedipa feels here, that even though he loves, Pynchon clearly loves the 60s, loves the hippie culture. He writes about it in so many different contexts and ways. He writes about it with reverence in Vineland, but he is not of that generation. He is of a slightly older generation. He went to college, like Oedipa, in the 1950s. And notice the way she describes her college experience. It was a time of nerves, blandness, and retreat. The exact opposite of the sort of vibrant, energetic, progressive, passionate 1960s. And she compares Berkeley to like Latin American universities, which were sort of associated with, or even Asian universities, which were associated with a certain protest culture, right? She says the kind of universities that bring governments down. But she's saying this is an American university. This is Berkeley. They're speaking English here. And that surprises her because the world in which she grew up, you did not question the government, right? In the 1950s, you did not question things like they did in the 1960s. If we continue reading, there's a little bit more to this passage. Where were Secretaries James and Foster and Senator Joseph, those dear daft noumena who'd mothered over Oedipus' so temperate youth? In another world. So that's, of course, references to Dulles and to Joseph McCarthy. So three prominent Republican politicians of the 1950s who represented a certain conservativeness, right? A certain, who represented basically the values of the 1950s that Oedipus is contrasting with the 1960s. And what does she say about them? She says, they're in another world, right? This is not that world anymore. This is a new time period. If we finish this paragraph, along another pattern of track, another string of decisions taken, switches closed, the faceless pointsmen who'd thrown them now all transferred, deserted, in stir, fleeing the skip tracers out of their skull, on horse, alcoholic, fanatic, under aliases, dead, impossible to find ever again. Among them they had managed to turn the young Oedipus into a rare creature indeed, unfit, perhaps, for marches and sit-ins, but just a whiz at pursuing strange words in Jacobean texts. And that, of course, is a great conclusion where, even though Oedipus felt this kind of distance from the 60s, she acknowledges she's unfit for marches, she's unfit for sit-ins, but what is she good at? She's good at pursuing strange words in Jacobean texts, right? The word tristero. So, Pynchon is presenting Oedipus as out of her depth, right? As a housewife, who can't quite grasp what she's discovering. But I think what's important is that Pynchon is not critical of Oedipus. He is not condescending towards Oedipus. His point is that we are all like Oedipus. We experience the world just as she's experiencing the world in this sort of half-knowledgeable state, trying to follow these clues to piece together meaning. And it's interesting that he positions her outside of the famous 1960s protest movements. It's kind of like she's looking into this world longingly and lovingly, maybe wishing she was a part of it, but knowing that she's not, knowing that she can't be. All right, so a few more passages that I want to touch on where she basically wanders around the Bay Area, right? Kind of in this, almost like this daze after everything she's learned, and she starts seeing the symbol of Tristero everywhere, the muted post horn, starts seeing the word waste everywhere, and she starts wondering about, the significance of it all. So this is Oedipus reflecting on everything that she's seen. Last night, she might have wondered what undergrounds, apart from the couple she knew of, communicated by waste system. By sunrise, she could legitimately ask what undergrounds didn't. If miracles were, as Jesus Arrabal had postulated years ago on the beach at Mazatlan, intrusions into this world from another, a kiss of cosmic pool balls, then so must be each of the night's post horns. For here were God knew how many citizens deliberately choosing not to communicate by U.S. mail. It was not an act of treason, nor possibly even of defiance, but it was a calculated withdrawal from the life of the Republic, from its machinery. Whatever else was being denied them out of hate, indifference to the power of their vote, loopholes, simple ignorance, this withdrawal was their own, unpublicized, private. Since they could not have withdrawn into a vacuum, could they? There had to exist the separate, silent, unsuspected world. So she's reflecting on all the people who she's discovered use this secret underground postal system to communicate, right? All the different undergrounds. And she kind of wonders why. And the conclusion she comes to, at least for now, is a calculated withdrawal from the life of the Republic, right? It seems to be, that Pynchon is suggesting, here is an alternative to America, in some way. Now, right after this moment, there's a wonderful passage, wonderful little section where she meets an old man who's sort of sitting on the steps of a rooming house. And I want to kind of read this whole section because it feels like a very key moment for Oedipa's journey. So I'm going to sort of read each little section and talk about it. So first, she sees the man sitting on the stairway. Through an open doorway, on the stair leading up into the disinfectant-smelling twilight of a rooming house, she saw an old man huddled, shaking with grief she couldn't hear. Both hands, smoke-white, covered his face. On the back of the left hand, she made out the post horn, tattooed in old ink now beginning to blur and spread. So she sees the post horn again, the symbol of Trastero. Fascinated, she came into the shadows and ascended creaking steps, hesitating on each one. When she was 3 steps from him, the hands flew apart, and his wrecked face and the terror of eyes gloried in burst veins stopped her. "Can I help?" She was shaking, tired. "My wife's in Fresno," he said. He wore an old double-breasted suit, frayed gray shirt, wide tie, no hat. "I left her. So long ago I don't remember. Now this is for her." He gave Oedipa a letter that looked like he'd been carrying it around for years. "Drop it in the..." And he held up the tattoo and stared into her eyes. "You know, I can't go out there. It's too far now. I had a bad night." "I know," she said, "but I'm new in town. I don't know where it is." "Under the freeway." He waved her on in the direction she'd been going. "Always one. You'll see it." So he's basically giving her a letter, asking her to deliver it. And now let's look at this next passage where she reflects on what the old man has witnessed and experienced. The eyes closed. Cammed each night out of that safe furrow, the bulk of this city's waking each sunrise again, set virtuously to plowing. What rich soils had he turned, what concentric planets uncovered, what voices overheard, flinders of luminescent gods glimpsed among the wallpaper's stained foliage, candle stubs lit to rotate in the air over him, prefiguring the cigarette he or a friend must fall asleep someday smoking, thus to end among the flaming secret salts held all those years by the insatiable stuffing of a mattress that could keep vestiges of every nightmare sweat, helpless overflowing bladder, viciously, tearfully consummated wet dream, like the memory bank to a computer of the lost. She was overcome all at once by a need to touch him, as if she could not believe in him or would not remember him without it. Exhausted, hardly knowing what she was doing, she came the last 3 steps and sat, took the man in her arms, actually held him, gazing out of her smudged eyes down the stairs, back into the morning. She felt wetness against her breast and saw that he was crying again. He hardly breathed, but tears came as if being pumped. "I can't help," she whispered, rocking him. "I can't help." It was already too many miles to Fresno. So basically, she sort of, instead of delivering the letter, she hugs him. She hugs him. And notice before she hugs him this long, beautiful, ruminative sentence where she reflects on all the things he's experienced. What she's experiencing here, what she's doing here is she's feeling this empathy for this man who represents essentially the downtrodden, the lost of America, right? He's essentially a homeless man who's asking her to deliver this letter. And this is one alternative way of interpreting Trastero. So previously we saw that Trastero might be this dark and evil secret society. Here we're getting a totally different vision. It becomes something that is used by those who have been discarded by America. And Oedipa seems to recognize that here, to recognize that in this moment. So I want to jump to the ending of the novel now, because after everything she discovers, eventually she ends up, the final section, she's about to go to an auction, right? This is where the title, The Crying of Lot 49, comes from. And she's hoping that at this auction, she's going to meet, finally, a representative of Trastero. But before she goes to that auction, she kind of reflects, basically, on everything that she's experienced. And this is a passage right towards the end of the novel, right? Towards the very end. I want to just look at this kind of long passage that I think does a great job of summarizing what Pynchon is trying to say about Trastero. and about Oedipa's long journey here. So she's reflecting specifically on the death of her lover, Pierce. And as she's walking, she's thinking about everything that's led her to where she is. She walked down a stretch of railroad track next to the highway. Spurs ran off here and there into factory property. Pierce may have owned these factories too. But what did it matter now if he'd owned all of San Narisco? San Narisco was a name, an incident among our climactic records of dreams, and what dreams became among our accumulated daylight, a moment's squall line or tornado's touchdown among the higher, more continental solemnities, storm systems of group suffering and need, prevailing winds of affluence. There was the true continuity. San Narisco had no boundaries. No one knew yet how to draw them. She had dedicated herself weeks ago to making sense of what Inverarity had left behind, never suspecting that the legacy was America. So here I think Pynchon most directly states that Inverarity's will, that she has been the executor of, the legacy is America itself. And that, I think, is the most direct thematic connection he makes. What Oedipa has been discovering about all of Pierce's corporate connections, right, and sort of the references to Trastero is really something about America, something about the country she lives in. And again, as we say, all these great novels, what they're trying to do is say something about the country and the time that they live in. And Pynchon here is no different. He is trying to make a comment about America in the 1960s. So then I want to jump ahead a little bit in this passage. I'm going to skip a few paragraphs, and I want to now look at her reflection on Trastero specifically. Yet she knew, head down, stumbling along over the cinder bed and its old sleepers, there was still that other chance, that it was all true, that Inverarity had only died, nothing else. Suppose, God, there really was a Trastero then, and that she had come on it by accident. If San Narisco and the estate were really no different from any other town, any other estate, then by that continuity she might have found the Trastero anywhere in her republic, through any of 100 lightly concealed entranceways, 100 alienations, if only she'd looked. She stopped a minute between the steel rails, raising her head as if to sniff the air. Becoming conscious of the hard, strung presence she stood on, knowing as if maps had been flashed for her on the sky, how these tracks ran into others, knowing they laced, deepened, authenticated the great night around her. If only she'd looked. So she's walking through railway tracks, right? And the railway tracks here become this important symbol for conspiracy, basically, for paranoia. Essentially, she's thinking, well, what if Trastero was real and all she had to do was look harder, right? And she would have seen it everywhere, right? Not just accidentally through Pierce's will. And that is, of course, the seductive thing about conspiracy, right? Is that once you start to suspect it, you start to wonder, is it everywhere? Are there patterns everywhere? The railroad tracks here seem to represent patterns that Oedipa is imagining, right? That Oedipa is thinking about. That is essentially what she's trying to trace and figure out, the larger pattern. And she can't quite do it here, but she's wondering, could she have done it if she looked harder? If we continue reading, she remembered now old Pullman cars left where the money'd run out, where the customers vanished, amid green farm flatnesses where clothes hung, smoke lazed out of jointed pipes. Were the squatters there in touch with others through Trastero? Were they helping carry forward that 300 years of the house's disinheritance? Surely they'd forgotten by now what it was the Trastero were to have inherited, and perhaps Oedipa one day might have. What was left to inherit? That America coded in Inverarity's testament, whose was that? She thought of other immobilized freight cars, where the kids sat on the floor planking and sang back, happy as fat, whatever came over the mother's pocket radio, of other squatters who stretched canvas for lean-tos behind smiling billboards along all the highways, or slept in junkyards in the stripped shells of wrecked Plymouths, or even, daring, spent the night up some pole in a lineman's tent like caterpillars, swung among a web of telephone wires, living in the very copper rigging and secular miracle of communication, untroubled by the dumb voltages flickering their miles, the night long in the thousands of unheard messages. So she's thinking here about all the sort of vagrants and vagabonds who might ride these railway cars, and she's imagining them even on the telephone wires, and of course thinking about communication, right? Because that's what Trastero and Thurn in Taxis was all about, communication. She's thinking about the communication of the telephone wires. And she's kind of imagining maybe they all knew about Trastero. Maybe they were all connected by it in some way. If we keep reading to the end of this passage, she remembered drifters she had listened to, Americans speaking their language carefully, scholarly, as if they were in exile from somewhere else, invisible yet congruent with the cheered land she lived in, and walkers along the roads at night, zooming in and out of your headlights without looking up, too far from any town to have a real destination. And the voices before and after the dead man's that had phoned at random during the darkest, slowest hours, searching ceaseless among the dial's 10 million possibilities, for that magical other who would reveal herself out of the roar of relays, monotone litanies of insult, filth, fantasy, love, whose brute repetition must someday call into being the trigger for the unnameable act, the recognition, the word. So she's sort of imagining people listening, right, on the phone, waiting for someone to say the thing that will reveal it all, right, that will make meaning for it. The word that makes you think of religion, that makes you think of God, right, a divine act. It's as if Pynchon is describing all of us. We're like people on these telephones, right, listening, right, to the other side, hoping to hear the word. And the word is capitalized here. It's not just any word, but the word, right? Some divine speech act that will make it all make sense. Of course, I think what Pynchon is also implicitly saying here is that we will not hear it. We will not hear the word, that we will listen. We will keep listening. We will keep trying to make meaning from all of this, but there will be no word. There will be no answer that brings it all together. And that is kind of what Oedipa seems to be reflecting on as well, the point she seems to be reaching. So then I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. I want to just look at the sort of almost the last passage of the novel. There's a little bit after this, but this is where Oedipa is now thinking about everything that she's experienced in the novel and trying to, again, make meaning from it. So, for it was now like walking among matrices of a great digital computer, the zeros and ones twinned above, hanging like balanced mobiles right and left, ahead, thick, maybe endless. Behind the hieroglyphic streets, there would be either a transcendent meaning or only the earth. So again, notice the dichotomy he's setting up in that sentence. Either there is going to be a transcendent meaning, the word, right? The divine word, something that will make it all make sense, or there's only the earth. Now, what do you think Pynchon believes? Transcendent meaning or only the earth? Let's keep reading. In the songs Miles, Dean, Serge, and Leonard sang was either some fraction of the truth's numinous beauty, as Mucho now believed, or only a power spectrum. Now, that's a reference to earlier she met these four kind of hippie songwriters who kind of a reference to the Beatles, right? And they're singing this song, and she's sort of saying, well, either there's going to be some numinous beauty in the song, or there's just a power spectrum. Her husband, Mucho, became paranoid, believing there was some hidden meaning in the music he was listening to. Continuing on, Tremaine, the swastika salesman's reprieve from Holocaust was either an injustice or the absence of a wind. The bones of the GIs at the bottom of Lake Inverarity were there either for a reason that mattered to the world or for skin divers and cigarette smokers. Ones and zeros. So he's essentially saying, the reference to the GIs at the bottom of the lake, which was where kind of this all started when she discovered the connection to Pierce. Either they died for a reason, they died for real meaning, or they died for nothing. Or not so much nothing, but just for capitalism, for the cigarette smokers. Because remember, the idea was that Pierce was part of this conspiracy to turn their bones into the charcoal for cigarettes. So did the couples arrange themselves. At Vesper Haven House, either an accommodation reached in some kind of dignity with the angel of death, or only death and the daily, tedious preparations for it. Another mode of meaning behind the obvious, or none. So again, the two options, the binary options that he's presenting, to use this computer metaphor, right, that he's using. Either there is transcendent meaning or there is no meaning. Either Oedipa in the orbiting ecstasy of a true paranoia or a real Trastero. For there either was some Trastero beyond the appearance of the legacy America, or there was just America. And if there was just America, then it seemed the only way she could continue and manage to be at all relevant to it was as an alien, unfurrowed, assumed full circle into some paranoia. So, what does that mean? What is he concluding here? He's sort of saying, and it's interesting, he doesn't really answer the question. I have my theory about what Pynchon believes and is implying here, but essentially he leaves Oedipa asking this question. Either Trastero is real, or she's just paranoid. And he doesn't say which is true, but he does say that if she's just paranoid, right, if it's just America, if there is no Trastero, then the only way she can stay relevant is to be an alien, unfurrowed, assumed full circle into some paranoia. I think he's describing there again, as I've said before, the experience of being an American at this time, the experience of interacting with all of these clues and references. And the point is either it's real, or if it's not real, you are like an alien, kind of wandering in this paranoid delusion. Basically, he's suggesting that paranoia is the only option that someone like her has in response to all the things that she's experienced. And implicitly, he's saying for us, for Americans, that's also the only option, the only answer maybe we have, paranoia as the only possibility. So it's kind of a dark ending if you think about it. It's kind of it's pretty depressing and sad. I think the most empathetic moment of the book was the moment I read where she hugs the old man, right? Perhaps he seems to be saying here that human connection between two people such as that is the only thing left in a world where you're flailing to find meaning, where you're trapped in this paranoia. But I think aside from that, much of the novel is very dark. It's a very dark depiction of America. It's a very dark depiction of conspiracy. It's a very dark depiction of our potential for knowing something, right? If we think just on a philosophical level, why is this book such a quintessential book associated with postmodernism? Well, it's because the point that he's making is that this is the postmodern condition. Believing that there could be something out there, some answer that would put it all together. Some, as he says, transcendent meaning, but not being able to really see it and being trapped in this state where either part of the binary could be true. And all you have to do is just be paranoid. And that's the answer. Now, later when we talk about other Pynchon novels, right, like Inherent Vice or Gravity's Rainbow, his ideas evolve, right, with the times. He develops his ideas. Not every novel of his is about this same thing. But that's the reason I wanted to start with this one, because I think at its core, it establishes exactly the kind of writer Pynchon is. And, from the perspective of a writer, what I take away from Pynchon, what I take away when I think of this novel overall, are a few things. On the one hand, the sentences themselves. Just the way Pynchon writes sentences, the way he is able to link clauses upon clauses, modifiers upon modifiers, to create these long, complex, convoluted sentences that we have to disentangle. Again, the prose reflects the experience he wants us to have as readers. He is not simply writing sentences for readability. He doesn't care about readability. He wants us to have an experience with language. The second thing I take away is the ability of someone to write a novel that reflects the world in which they live. So Pynchon has done this with this novel. Just as last week when we discussed Brideshead Revisited, when we discussed Evelyn Waugh, in a totally different way, Evelyn Waugh also reflected the world in which he lived, the world in which he grew up. And that's why both of these books we've discussed so far, we can think of as masterpieces. We can think of as literary classics. I'm going to return again to that point many times in the future, but when we're writing books, when we're trying to create something of lasting value, if we can say something about the world we live in, if we can say something about the time we are alive, then our work will have meaning. If there is such a thing as universality, right? Universality can only express itself through the particularities of the time and the place that you were born and that you grew up and that the era in which you live. And we see that here with Pynchon. He's expressing something that approaches a kind of universal phenomenon, this paranoid feeling of grasping at a meaning that you can't quite understand. I mean, in some ways, this was perhaps the experience of people in the Middle Ages, right? They sort of understood that there were things in the world beyond their comprehension, beyond their control. They saw signs and symbols everywhere of divinities, of gods. And perhaps all they could do was have this paranoia, which could be called faith, right, in a different context. And that was the only response. And I think Pynchon is kind of saying, well, in the 1960s, we are no longer the civilization of rationality, of the Enlightenment, of certainty. All we have now is this uncertainty, right? That's the only way we can live and we can continue. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for being here. Next time, we're going to switch gears again, and we're going to go back in time a little bit and talk about The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. So that's it from me. If you like what you heard, remember to share the podcast, spread the word. It's always good to have more listeners. Thank you all. See you all next time.